We have Trump's attempted takeover of Iceland, and which was thankfully stopped by the Irish government.
Greenland, Rory.
Greenland.
Yeah, you don't want to make that mistake like Trump.
Fáilte Arás, our Súil Eile, welcome back to A Different View. I'm Rory Hearn.
I'm Patricia Stevenson.
And we're giving the big takes on the big news this week. So we have had some major issues. We have wealth inequality in Ireland and globally. We have Trump's attempted takeover of Iceland, and which was thankfully stopped by the Irish government.
Greenland, Rory.
Greenland.
Yeah, you don't want to make that mistake like Trump.
No, I don't. And I think that came actually from Waterford Whispers, not the actual news. We're also going to look at rents at investor funds and some other interesting things. Patricia, to start off, what a week.
What a week. I know. I think the biggest story this week was, of course, the Beckham family feud.
Absolutely.
Which took up a lot of airtime. No, I mean, obviously, seriously, the biggest story was international affairs. Trump's utterly erratic behaviour over the last few weeks. We had the invasion of Venezuela, followed by attempts on sovereign territory of Greenland, potential trade war being threatened, and now a massive U-turn as of yesterday. So it's a bit like it's been whiplash, I think, following Trump's actions in the last few weeks.
And I heard this phrase taco, and it's like, they're things we eat, aren't they?
Well, we do eat tacos, but also has been popularized Trump always chickens out taco. Now, it's funny, and Trump often does U-turn, but actually I feel like this is his strategy for pushing what's normal. So he can push the idea of a trade war and then do a U-turn, but maybe in a few weeks something else is going to happen. So while it's a bit funny to call him taco or whatever, it is a kind of like a strategic tactic that he uses to kind of push the boundaries of decency and what is normal.
And it does seem, I think, for a lot of people, they look at it and Trump is giving like this entertainment, and it's almost like he knows that, and that's what he's trying to do. But actually behind Trump is a much, let's call it's an imperial agenda. It is an agenda to get resources, and of course it is acting for the big tech companies, the billionaires.
Absolutely.
And that's the agenda.
And I think that's what we're seeing as well with the Gaza peace plan, which was also announced the last 24 hours. Like another major component of that was it feels very much like kind of almost like a commercial land grab for territory in Palestine. So that's part of that whole agenda. And it's absolutely been driven by this kind of imperialistic kind of point of view. I think it's really important to remember, though, like Trump, whilst he represents a lot of people and there's a whole load of supporters around him in the US administration, there are loads of Americans who are horrified by what's happening and they are trying to oppose him. And I think it's really important that we kind of connect with those people that are feeling, living under a regime where they feel very threatened.
Absolutely. I think, across the world, we've seen major public reaction, against his attempts around Greenland, and also, of course, Venezuela, actually what he did there. And it is that, I think, for people looking at it, we've seen the US intervening, over the last century in Iraq, what they did. And it's like, this is it back again. It's this, kind of absolute, we want to control the world. We want to get the resources, and who is it for? And then I think something that Irish people, would be particularly concerned around, is what role the Irish government plays in this. And as well, we've seen now this new Board of Peace, which unfortunately, it just seems, is this going to replace the UN?
That's what it seems. It seems like an attempt to create this other system. And it's so important. The UN is the system that governs, amongst other things, international law. And we have to stand true to that. We can't have any of these other, these additional mechanisms in place which don't have international buy-in, which don't abide by international law. Putin has been invited onto the Board of Peace. Putin, who's currently, responsible for an illegal invasion and war in Ukraine, how can he even be considered for an invitation to this? It's utter chaos. It's complete nonsense, and it won't bring sustainable peace to Gaza.
No, and of course, also who's on it is Netanyahu, who actually couldn't be there for the signing because would be indicted as a war criminal. Yeah. This is absolutely. This is not about peace. This is, again,
we're living in the matrix. This isn't normal. This isn't okay. And I think it's really important that we always remind ourselves of that. And the whole thing there, I suppose we were talking about kind of the money behind a lot of this stuff. We also had a report from Oxfam Ireland that came out this week about the number of billionaires that we now have.
Absolutely. And of course, that is when you go back and look, where is this all coming from in terms of Trump? Who funded him to get there? It was the billionaires. Why is Trump, what is the phenomenon of Trump and the shift to the right and all this, anti-immigrant stuff? And it is about trying to get attention away from the massive inequality that we have seen grown globally over the last 20 or 30 years. The figures for Ireland that Oxfam produced are absolutely, they are astounding. 11 billionaires in Ireland have equivalent wealth to 66% of the population. 11 billionaires. They have 46 billion between them. And it just takes 7.3 hours for these billionaires to make the same amount of money as the average person on an average income does.
It's shocking. And I think it's really important to remember, so like, it wasn't always like this. We didn't always have billionaires. If you think 40 years ago, perhaps our parents' generation, there were people who had more than other people, but there was much more equality, in terms of how wealth was distributed. And we have to start looking at wealth taxes. We don't need people there is actually only so much money in the world. We don't generate more wealth in that sense. It just moves from the sort of lower classes upwards. That's the system that we currently have. And what we saw, I think, from the Oxfam report is also that wealth inequality is actually driving authoritarianism. It's creating less social cohesion. It is creating less stability in our communities, and it's ultimately only a bad thing.
Yeah, and this is something that it's been growing and growing, and its part relates back to, the attack goes back to Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, the attacks on trade unions, who actually played a key role in pushing for better wages for workers. And we had much higher taxes in the past on higher incomes. But this is part of this agenda that has gone on for 30, 40 years. And it's gone to this point now where we are back at levels of inequality not seen since the start of the last century. That, of course, then led to, in part, world wars, that led to market crashes. And when we look at the big tech billionaires and AI and all what they're doing, and I think it's quite, people are feeling it's very dystopian at the moment.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are feeling like that. And it's also a little bit linked to another story that came up in the week in terms of, I suppose, where we're identifying, people to invest in the country. And that was the government going to Cannes to court investors to come into Ireland. On the surface of it, a lot of people might think, okay, that sounds positive, bringing inward investment. But could you maybe explain a little bit why having investor funds coming into Ireland to build housing hasn't worked up to this point and won't work going forward?
Yeah, this was a big story that came, that the Irish government is actually going to Cannes in March in partnership with institutional investor funds to bring in more global capital into Irish housing. And what does that mean? It means more investor funds building more apartments at rents that no one can afford, and actually buying up land. So it adds more competition to the price of land. It pushes up the price of land, which pushes up the price of housing. They also buy up more. They buy up apartment blocks. They push up house prices. And the government have really gone in hard on this. And of course, they're also bringing in new rent measures, which will mean rents will go up from the 1st of March for in between tenancies. For new market rents, there'll be able to be more resetting to new market rents, all for these investor funds, these vulture funds. And we saw, there was a huge outcry a number of years ago around the vulture funds buying housing estates and buying up housing. And the government said, yeah, we're going to clamp down on this. They've now gone the complete opposite. They're absolutely they're working with them, facilitating them, giving them tax breaks. And I think people really need to call this out.
And a lot of these big investor firms, they're actually owned by even larger conglomerates, which are responsible for Blackstone,
but they're actually responsible for the wealth inequality. Yeah. Because how does it work? Wealthy people put their money into these funds, who then invest in things like property, get loads of rent, and that goes back to the wealthy. Where are they taking the rent from? It is young people, it's working people. So it's this actually making the wealthy wealthier, while those who are forced to rent, who can't afford to buy a home, get squeezed even more. And we've this inequality, and there is a huge, as you mentioned earlier, huge socially corrosive impact of inequality. Like, you look at young people, the impact on self-esteem, people who kind of feel, I can't get on in life, there's something wrong with me, and rather than actually it's the system.
And it creates comparisons, and it creates a sense that we can always have more. And that's that whole thing of we are then encouraged almost to fight amongst ourselves, and I suppose the message from that is don't punch down, punch up. There's a handful of people with huge amounts of money, and it's not getting distributed. And then we're encouraged to have divisions amongst each other, whether that's based on the type of jobs we have, where we went to school, the colour of our skin, our religion, or whatever else. and that also drives that social division.
Absolutely, and we see that the government doing that, blaming immigrants for trying to blame immigrants for the housing crisis, trying to deflect attention away from their failures, and the fact that they are giving hundreds of millions away to global funds, public money, like it's outrageous. But we just wanted to finish up with one or two little stories. The very funny one, Pascal Donoghue was in the news again.
He was, yeah. He was telling us that we have to be conscious of the fact that data centres take up a lot of water, which is true. But there's just certain irony to Pascal Donoghue saying this in his new role whenever he's been in the cabinet for years. And we are permitting more, data centres to being built. So it's just like a kind of, I'm not using the word whiplash again, but from one point of view to the other, sort of lecturing us now that we need to be looking after the water supply in Ireland.
And it was interesting because we were talking earlier about this, that it was interesting reflecting on Pascal Donoghue's decision to go to the World Bank. And there was questions raised about the fact that he increased the funding going to the World Bank last year while he was minister, but also this issue of it was a very short space of time after the election to go take up this new job. And I think it sort of left a bad taste in a lot of people's, particularly in his constituency. You're just elected and then you're off doing this other job.
Yeah, it's a little disingenuous, isn't it? At the end of the day, you put yourself forward, you ask people to vote for you, and then, within a year, you're at the gap again and moving on to the next thing. I don't think that that's necessarily good for the system. I think when people are committed to taking a role, they should at least see it out,
And the last story just is a little one, an update actually from our last podcast, where we were talking about the video that the Department of Housing had no involvement in, and now subsequently has come out, the Irish Examiner reported that actually the Department of Housing did know. And I asked the Minister for Housing directly about it today. He sort of gave a garbled answer, didn't really answer, but we're going to follow up again with that one. But the biggest question I know people have, your scarf, Patricia. Tell us about it.
Oh, thanks very much. Thanks for noticing. This was my Christmas present from my best friend, and it's by a designer called Aoife Crawley. It's all the symbols of Ireland, symbols of Éire.
Gohíntacht. Listen, thank you so much everyone for watching and listening, and if you have any questions or comments, please send them in. Thank you very much. For me, Rory Hearn.
Patricia Stevenson. Till next time.
Till next time, indeed.